Hey all, it's Loeks. Let's look at an example of a 1 acre edible ecosystem, and we're going to do this by breaking it down into a series of triads. You can see here that this triad represents three beds that equal 15 feet because the individual bed itself here is 5 feet. Now, by what length? Well, we're creating a 1 acre edible ecosystem that's a square 1 acre. So that's roughly 208 feet by 208 feet or 43,560 square feet. So this 1 acre at 208 by 208, and if we count the number of triads here, we end up with actually an area that's 210 by 210. So that's really our solid acre. So we have our triads here. We have triad, we can number them off if we want. We can letter them off however we want if we want to organize it that way. So we could say that we have a triad, 1, 2, 3, and then we have a triad 4, 5, and 6. We have a triad 7, 8, and 9. We have a triad 10, 11, and 12. And we have a triad 13 and 14. So that's one way to look at it, is to actually just count out that we have 14 triads. But another way is to think of them in blocks of 3 triads, just like there's 3 beds to a triad, or to break them out as just simply alternating the triads. And that can be really, really useful as well. So if we alternated the triads, we might put in here a triad and make it like a kind of primary thickness like this, just to help us differentiate it on the board. And that's a good way to start to lay out your overall edible ecosystem plot. Now, you could of course go back and watch some videos or check out some of my other content on the Permabed system and on edible ecosystem design in general. This is going to be a detailed example of just building out an edible ecosystem and just discussing it so you can really see it evolve in the plan. Because at the end of the day, if your goal is to create an edible ecosystem plot that's about an acre, then you really just need to see how different guild unit triads can be assembled. So remember, over here, you could consider that we have all these different versions of different guild unit triads that we might want to be putting into here. We could have one that has a dominant tree in the middle as its key species. We could have one that's mainly made out of herbs and ground covers, with the key species being a large herb. We could have one that's focused on berry bushes. These are different guts or guild unit triads, and there's different variations of what the plants are that are in those that companion, but we're gonna move these into the design and place them in order to create a really solid 1 acre edible ecosystem. So we've created our alternate patterning here. Now, one of the things I'm going to look at here is say, well, what I actually want to do is really focus on creating an edible ecosystem that is balanced in terms of accessibility. So do we want this 1 acre to be the actual food forest itself, or do we want the 1 acre to include the buffer zone, etc.? I'm going to go ahead and include that buffer zone into this design. So you have 1 acre of land that you're managing, that you're building around, that you're really creating into it. So let's start by putting that buffer zone in. I'm going to use a green in here, and I'm just going to say that this here is a buffer of a sort of like alternative lawn, right? So we're going to call this an alternative lawn here. So that is what this guild design is. It's an alternative lawn. It's a low growing, low mow, low invasive species, not like plants that are really going to want to encroach into your edible ecosystem, right? So let's do the same thing over here. Let's balance this out, and let's say in the same place we have this, this various thing. Now the simplest version of this, you could just do like a dwarf clover or something like that in here and just have that as your alternative lawn. But you could have a mix. You could have a low growing a mixture of flowering pollinator plants. You could have shortgrass prairie restoration on the edges. It could be just thymes and other low creeping herbs and stuff like that. You could choose whatever you want. And now, one of the other things I would consider in here is that this portion of land is not actually built up into raised beds. It's actually flat. So this actually goes like this, because you want to be able to balance this with your your land out here that maybe you have, maybe it's meeting a road, or maybe it's meeting like lawn, or maybe it's meeting something else. So that's just something to consider. Like maybe out here you actually have your lawn, right? So that's something to consider, is whether or not you are going to have that be flat. And I would say that that's a good idea, because you're not going to want to have a mowing kind of happening along the edge here up onto a raised bed. It's more likely you're going to want to be able to just kind of mow that buffer zone here, and be able to maximize this edge management right here, right? So there's your edge. So management of that edge is important. So a little bit of flat ground there would be beneficial in order to manage that edge. Now, another thing I just want to mention here is that if we're creating a 1 acre food forest design, you have to have a piece of land that's a little bigger than an acre. If you only have exactly 1 acre of like a big backyard, then this design is going to need to include like a little bit of perimeter lawn. And that's where I might say, well, if you only have 1 acre, then this alternative lawn that's 1 triad is enough to pass with like a small pickup truck, and certainly with like a little yard tractor, and move around the plot with a 2-wheel tractor. So that then becomes the design. So if you have exactly 1 acre square, then this last triad on either side is completing your, like that would be, the fence would be here, your neighbor's fence or something like that, right? And if you have a larger field, then you're including it as a buffer within it. Now, your perfect square field might not be what you have. So this is based on a perfect square acre. And that means that generally speaking, you have a large enough piece of land that you can choose to make a perfect square within it. But what you'll be able to see is how you can shift this. Maybe the beds are longer, maybe there's not as much, but you just do that by arranging it. So we're just making an idealized organization and patterning of different guild unit triads to make this edible ecosystem as a sort of model design, and you can switch that up. Okay, so the other thing we're going to do here is we're really going to focus on a lot more fruit in this example. I have another example that's looking more at an edible woodland that's a little bit more open. It's almost more edible savanna if you don't have anything else planted. So in this example, I really want to focus in on having a lot of fruit. So this guild is going to have a fruit tree here, and then we're actually going to have a fruit tree here, and we're going to have a fruit tree here, here, and here, and here. So now you can see we've really actually got a lot of fruit in this guild. This has got 6 of its triads are focused on fruit production. So that's a high density of fruit production. So if you look here at the total number of triads out of 14, we've got a ratio here where 6 out of 14 are fruit triads, fruit focused triads. So now let's put in our, in between our prairie. So we could come in here and I'm just gonna go like this and just say this is all sort of in prairie, including right up to it. But we can add a little detail in there. But just to see it, to see that this is mostly open space. And if that's the case, we really have a lot of access in here, because we're going to be able to say, even come in here with a tractor, say if we wanted to, this tractor could drive right here, straddling one of these 5-foot beds like this, right? So here's a little dudette or dude in the tractor. So, maybe they're saying something like, oh boy, fruit, right? So they're really excited here, okay? Are you getting excited? I'm excited. All right. So the reason I put that in there, all jokes aside, is to allow yourself to start to think about how you might actually move through this fruit forest and maintain it. So the moment I add in here a bush layer, if I wanted to put a bush layer and I put that bush layer in, say, the middle of this triad like this, I still have 2 triads that I can move through, but not evenly. Being able to move equidistant, giving the same value in terms of organization to a tree as to primary access would be really, really useful. So having it right here in the middle gives lots of elbow room for these trees to grow. You know, we're essentially creating a space between the trees, remember, of 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. That's a nice amount of spacing to give some access and some elbow room. Do I need to have a tractor on either side of all the trees? Not necessarily, because if I wanted a tractor job for fruit harvest, for instance, I could harvest fruit off this tree into a bucket of that tractor. I could harvest fruit off this tree into a bucket of that tractor. If I decide to put a berry bush in every other one of these beds, like this, every other triad like that, if I wanted to create that the pattern, that's fine. Because here too, I could actually harvest in like this, right? And here I have access here, on the edges I have access here. So you have that access. You know, the berries themselves, you could carry like this, or like this, or of course you still have access. You could still come in here and manage this, you know, with something like a 2-wheel tractor. You know, you can come in here and be able to manage this. So that's just to show you that your scale of organization for access depends on the scale of equipment you use. That's how much room you have to leave. If you want to get more intensive, then go to a 2-wheel tractor, because then you can be more intensive. But also it could be a truck that's moving down that laneway as well. But this is a pretty good edible ecosystem design. It's got a lot of benefits to it. Now I want to go in here and discuss a little more one of the variations, and that's that I can put also a berry in line with this fruit tree. The difference here is that this berry that I'm putting in here is going to be better understood as the type of fruit that's like a currant or a gooseberry, as an example, because they will do fairly well in partial shade. But you know, even that's not necessarily the main point, because I could spread out. Remember, this is just looking at it. These beds run 200 feet this way, 210 feet this way. I could spread out the patterning of the fruit trees and the berry bushes in that line of that 200-foot long bed to whatever ratio I want to maintain lots of sun for those berries in there if I want. So the reason I focus on currants or gooseberries, you know, or things like that, or even maybe haskaps even would be another one I might focus on, is because they don't spread aggressively like a raspberry from suckers, and they hold their form. So being able to access my fruit tree for harvest, being able to bring a ladder in there, being able to move and maintain the rodent guards and mulching, I don't recommend blending raspberries with fruit trees as a guild. I have other plantings that I use raspberries for with trees, and I can get into some of those examples. It might be if I have a reforestation where I have a lot of really like future trees that are going to take a while to grow, then the raspberries are nice thick. They can kind of even like help be trellised off those trees, and they protect them from deer pressure because they're thick and thorny, maybe, things like that. But otherwise, I prefer to see the raspberry as its own hedge out here, because it's really easy to manage it in terms of its suckers and stuff. For instance, I could have these beds here in some sort of low-growing herb, or I could cultivate them. I could choose to manage them for those raspberries. Am I just mowing them to keep the raspberry suckers down and to have a good picking path on either side? Am I cultivating them and allowing raspberry suckers to shoot up into them, and then I'm harvesting the suckers out, and I'm harvesting them as their own, you know, yield? However I do it, it's nice to have the raspberries in their own bed. Another reason is you can actually mow raspberries down occasionally and undercut them and actually divide and move those canes out. You can even burn the patch temporarily if it gets too weedy. There's a lot of things you can do because raspberries are canes that die back. They're not a woody stem like you have on a tree, and they're not also a woody stem like you have on currants, gooseberries, or haskaps. It's really a very different type of bush. It is actually cane. So I like to not mix them. I like to keep these woody stems together in this woodland design. So that woodland design that's right here in a nutshell, a little micro version of it, is that it has this fruit tree like this, and then it has this berry bush like this, and then it will have some sort of like shade-loving ground covers like this, and that's the pattern that repeats in line. That's what that is. That's a very much an edible woodland bed. And then if you have the majority of these like this, it creates a bit of an edible woodland, especially we're maintaining this space in here with these raspberries as well. So now we have that in here. We can think about these. Here's these shade-loving varieties. Now, initially, there's not going to be as much shade, so that's all about transition. It's all about understanding what you might plant in with these trees when they're small and then transition it. An edible ecosystem is about, allowing it to evolve and taking into consideration what you have to do in the short term and in the long term. And not every single one of these needs to have a bush in it too. You could have every other one of these be having bush growing in line with it, and then the other ones you could have more of a focus on tall growing herbs that you want, or other benefits, pollinator hedge plants. So we could just add that into the design. Now I want you to really appreciate that although I'm saying some varieties, in here, I guess I mixed that up, so no bush in here. I'm also leaving it a little bit open. I'm working off the principles of design. I'm creating organization of form and function and thinking about it from these perspectives before I throw the species in there. Because that's all you have to do. Like if I decide now, for instance, that actually, the middle bed, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, if I decide that, somewhere in here I want to add a little more variety to it, even if I wanted to put a large tree right in the middle of the entire plot for some reason and actually have the middle even become its own type of access, its own type of design. If I wanted to make this more of a forest environment, I could do that. And I don't even have to tell you what this tree is, right? I can just tell you that that's going in there. Maybe it's a nitrogen fixing tree, so I can get a lot more nitrogen leaf fall and things like that. I can put this in as a placeholder of the design before I specify that it's a locust. And that is really important because I'm trying to show model designs, because wherever you are in the world, if you're in Australia and Tasmania, or you're in, Scandinavia, or you're in South Africa, or you're in Guatemala, or you're in California, or you're in New York State, maybe you're in Alberta, maybe you're in the Yukon, maybe you're in Nova Scotia, maybe you're in Argentina. Does it matter? No, it doesn't matter. This is a design philosophy, and it's a design layout that then can take into account whatever this species is. If I'm saying it should be a nitrogen fixer, all you have to do is figure out your hardiness zone and figure out what nitrogen fixing large trees could you use in your design, and then understand that tree a little bit and how it grows, and figure out how you would design it into the system. But the patterning makes sense. The patterning of creating accessibility, the patterning of creating layers of plants that have different shape and different size heights, the patterning of alternating, berries, the patterning of having a raspberry, even if it's not a raspberry. Well, what if it's a plant that produces a berry or has some use that's really suckers a lot but doesn't have a woody stem? Well, that's fine. That's a plant that you might take into consideration in this design. So another thing I'll do out here is I'll probably place in here, depending on where we are. If this is lawn here, I'd put my cap plant here, but I might put my cap plant here as well if this is your actual lawn. But somewhere in here, I'll put a cap plant. So I'm gonna go ahead and put it out here, and I'm just gonna say, here's your cap plant, which I really like rhubarb, but you could have a different type of cap plant. You could have like a big bush of, say, like lemon balm or something like that. That could work very well. And a cap plant just is another buffer against the invasion of your other surrounding field, whatever plants make up the matrix of species diversity there. So we have our cap plant in here. We have our alternating herbs. We have our berry bushes that are raspberries here. We've even added in a big locust tree, as a large nitrogen fixer. So we've got a large nitrogen fixer here. We have some access built in. So now we can start to think about different fruits and what we're doing. So one way to arrange these fruits is to say everything here is like early maturing, and everything here is mid, and this might be late. And then you might alternate this back to early, mid, late. So that's one design philosophy that is a really great one, because what it does is it means that, if I'm picking in that hedge, then most of what I'm getting there is earlier in the year. So I'm sort of picking off that entire bed. Now I could do a whole plot early, but I'm breaking it up a little bit. But it means that when I go down there, all the berries, all the fruits that are in there are all earlier maturing. So maybe the fruits in there are things like dwarf cherries that are fairly early, and haskaps are really early, things like that. Whereas if I'm doing a later pears are in here, later apples are in here, etc. So that's one way to organize it. Another way to organize it, and I primarily do this in the row itself, is if I'm looking down the length of the row, but you can also do this across rows. If I'm looking down the length of the row, the fruit trees that are in the length of the row, I'll often have it organized between plums and pits. So if your primary fruit trees that are very popular are either ones that have seeds like apples and pears, or they're pits like apricots or plums. And so I alternate those because there's less disease sharing. Now there's other plants that are completely unrelated, like let's say, putting in here like autumn olive or something like that. They're not related to any of these. So that can break it up even more. But if I was to focus a lot on the popular fruits like apples, pears, nectarines, plums, apricots, things like that, I tend to put 2 of one type. So if I'm doing plums, maybe it's like apples, and there's a nice pollinator buddy there, and then I switch it to pits, and maybe it's like plums, and then I might switch it, and I usually have a break in between like this with something like an autumn olive. Then I would switch it back again to a plum, but instead of apples this time maybe it's pears, and then I would have another like autumn olive, nitrogen fixing and also edible, and then I would have another pit. Instead of pears this time, maybe I would do plums. So that's a way of patterning in the length of the bed that breaks it up for disease, but still keeps a pattern. And the pattern is really important for things like harvest again, because when it comes to harvest, obviously the most efficient thing is just to have a line of all apples that are mature at the same time. But in a 1-acre food forest, you're really more concerned about, health and vigor and resilience and overall sustainable yields. And it's okay to cruise down this lane and harvest your apples and then keep going and just pass that other fruit that's not part of that harvest and then harvest the next thing. Now, if you do this with this design and you organize it into the bed early, then you're breaking up disease here, but you could come along with a garden cart, or you come along with a tractor or a pickup, and you could just pick all the early apples and then all the early pears, etc. So, you're able to, seasonally just kind of pick these all mixed into their individual crates, but you're still picking that whole bed. So this is a good overall design, is to organize the beds in terms of early, mid, late, but to organize diversity in the rows so there's some repetition, but ultimately you're creating breaks against disease sharing between different plants. The downside to some of this is that if you are using different pest management protocols or different disease protocols, maybe you're using sprays, biological sprays, maybe you're using pest prevention techniques, like maybe you're going and putting socks on all the fruit to keep out moths and stuff. Whatever it is you're doing, the more broken up and diverse it is in the row, the less efficient that work is. You might have to skip over things and things like that. So another model which I can present is what is really an edible hedge ecosystem, where you have complete species monocultures in the bed for really efficient management down a single bed, but there's a lot of variety and disease prevention accounted for across the layout of the whole plot. So that's another model. So I'm just trying to show you some different models, but ultimately you can see in here that we've broken this up. Here we've got our ground covers in here, here we've got these different things that we could theme, however, and we talk about this in some other content, but this could be culinary herbs in here. We could be focusing on things like lovage and chives and sorrel and things that are all like leaves that you cut and you can use for culinary purposes. This could have a focus on tea plants, like things like bee balms and lemon balms and things that you might want to harvest and put in tea, roses, things like that. You could focus on plants that are just pollinator plants, so plants where you really just want to have a lot of flowers and create nectar sources throughout the years. You can theme these however you want. For the areas where you're primarily going to have access here, These, you could really think of them as access alleys. And so you might really focus on lower growing plants and herbs, creeping wild strawberries and thymes and even chives, like things that are very, very low, where it's easy to mow them or to just drive over top of them. Or they could be things like a prairie restoration, right? Where, even in there, you're really not concerned if you have to do heavy traffic over that in some respects. If you don't drive, you allow them to flourish and provide habitat. And then when you do drive, or if you do move through it, you're not like moving through an area where, you want to cut a bunch of leaves. Other areas might be areas where you have self-seeding vegetables growing and they're just seeding, and you can go out and pick seasonally whenever they're ready and just maintain that area for an abundance of those self-seeding crops, lettuces and kales and parsleys and things like that that are growing, endives that are just coming back and flourishing. So whatever themes you apply into those, you see that they are alternating. They are the movement corridors for humans and a two-wheel tractor like a BCS. And these areas are big enough for a truck or for a larger tractor. And maintaining that openness, even if you operate on just a two-wheel tractor scale, maintaining areas of openness generally will facilitate the design overall. So this is a pretty solid design concept for a 1 acre edible ecosystem. And of course, I always like to say, one thing I like to point out at the end of a video like this is just to think about this area as actually one complete garden bed now, because this is a perfectly fine single bed design. Remember this layout design here. So if this is a 210-foot long area, you can either look at it as having these raised beds that are 5 feet wide, and these are representing the head of all these beds that are running down the length of the food forest plot. Or you could look at this as being one bed. Take all those bumps out and just think of this as one single bed. Imagine that now we're looking at just this bed, right? This bed is in triad number 5. It's the middle bed. So now I'm looking at the middle bed, bed 2 in triad number 5. What is the planting plan for it? This is the planting plan. Cap plant, a big herb kind of meadow, a fruit tree with herbs, berry bush, fruit tree with herbs and berry bush, a big herb meadow, fruit tree with herbs, berry bush, fruit tree with herbs with berry bush, big open meadow, fruit tree with herbs, berry bush, fruit tree with herbs with berry bush, cap plant. That is a great design for a single bed, and that is the beauty of this modular design. And it's a great kind of mental trick to see that the design, if you're aiming for a woodland design of a certain ecosystem ratio, and this one is 6:14 for triads, that are focused on fruit, then that ends up being the same density the other way. You have the same sort of spacing working out. So if you're looking for this kind of very solid ecosystem ratio, your design runs both ways. If I want to plant a single edible hedge of one bed, here you go. This is a great layout for a single edible hedge. Here's that middle bed. That middle bed is this, and then this outer bed might be in asparagus or something like that. This might have, strawberries, right? And then this has the berry bush and the different medicinal herbs and this tree. There's your edible hedge, just a 15-foot wide hedge by 300 feet or 3,000 feet, doesn't matter. So there is a good look at a 1 acre edible ecosystem concept and taking into account, some different themed areas like alternative lawns, cap plants, and really looking at how you can break up your fruit guilds from early, mid, and late, and also break them up between plums and pits for disease management, and some considerations about accessibility and harvestability concerns, and then really taking a look at how you can see that this is a 210-foot single bed, or it's a 210-foot wide plot with a bunch of beds in these 14 triads that run 210 feet long. So solid concept, good food for thought, and I'll see you in the next one.